Hey guys, tonight we slip back into the cool hush of a lake that no longer exists in the way it once did. You're hovering in the middle of a wide expanse of shimmering water, and around you, rising out of the mist, are gardens that appear to float. They're perfectly rectangular, trimmed like puzzle pieces laid side by side, separated by slim canals where canoes glide silently. Torches flicker on the water, and the scent of wet earth mixes with roasting maize. It feels a little unreal, like Venice dreamed up by gardeners who were also poets. You'd probably last about 3 minutes here before the mosquitoes convinced you to head home. But let's pretend you've got stronger willpower than most modern city folk. These were the famous chinampas, sometimes called floating gardens. And they made the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan not just livable, but staggeringly abundant. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your location and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your canoe nudges forward, the wooden hull creaking softly. Ahead, the chinampas gleam under moonlight. They aren't rafts tied up with vines like a children's craft project. They're methodical, engineered, practical. You notice how they seem to float, yet the willows planted along the sides fix them firmly in place. The roots stretch down into the silty lake bed, acting like natural anchors. If you lean over the side of your canoe, you see a shimmer of fish darting below. A farmer poles past you. His canoe is slim and steady, carved from a single ahuehuet trunk, the water sliding off its sides in little ripples. He doesn't look surprised to see you. This is a dream after all, so he waves and gestures toward his plot. You drift closer. Each garden glows with green maize stalks, beans spiraling up their sides, squash leaves broad and flat like parasols. The colors are deep, made richer by the mineral-heavy lake water. You reach out, brushing the damp air, almost smelling the sharp tang of chili plants nearby. Historians still argue whether these gardens should really be called floating, since many were more like semi-fixed islands built up from the lake bottom. But the illusion of levitation is undeniable. A mainstream fact here, these chinampas could yield up to 7 harvests a year, thanks to the perpetual moisture and the constant renewal of mud from the lake. In other words, ancient hydroponics without the buzzing LED lights. And here's your quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that farmers used to time their planting not just by calendars, but also by watching the croaking intensity of frogs. If the frogs sang loudly, rains were near and it was a good time to push maize seeds into the earth. Next time you hear frogs outside your window, you can feel smugly Aztec. You close your eyes for a moment, listening. Canoe poles dip rhythmically, a quiet thud against the lake bed. Somewhere in the distance, drums echo from Tenochtitlan's temples. And over everything, a fragrance of earth, maize, and lake water settles, strangely comforting. As you glide along, you think about how precarious yet secure this all feels. Water everywhere and yet order carved into it with straight edges and careful rows. Feels like someone tried to domesticate the lake itself, and the lake, perhaps amused, allowed it. For now the air is cool, stars shimmer, mirrored in the water so perfectly that for a moment you can't tell if you're floating through the sky or through the earth. You run your hand through the surface and disturb both heavens and lake in one movement. Your guide, the farmer who waved you over, pulls alongside again. He shows you how his willow poles create boundaries. Some are new, freshly cut, stuck into the lake floor like fence posts. Others have grown roots, branches stretching up to shade the crops. They aren't just supports. They're companions to the garden, alive and patient. You trail him to the edge of a chinampa where baskets sit piled high, maize ears golden and firm, amaranth with delicate seeds, chili peppers dried to a leathery red. He sets one basket in your canoe and chuckles, as though you might cook later. But the only fire you'll be making tonight is the one in your imagination. From here, Tenochtitlan rises in the distance. You glimpse the outlines of temples, causeways lit by flickering torches, and a marketplace where the hum of voices drifts faintly across the water. The whole city rests on the lake, like a giant version of the gardens, anchored yet floating, teeming with life. You exhale slowly. The water laps. The night air is cool and thick, pressing gently against your skin. And in this moment, you're part of a rhythm older than most nations, surrounded by ingenuity disguised as tranquility. The canoe glides steadily forward, and you find yourself at the edge of one garden where construction is happening in real time. It's not noisy. No hammering, no clanking metal, no neon vests or hard hats. Instead, there's a patient rhythm to the work. You watch as two farmers, bare feet planted in shallow water, lower a woven mat of reeds into the lake. The mat darkens instantly, soaking through, sagging with the weight of water, yet it holds together, as if it knows it's meant to become the floor of something larger. They drag willow stakes down from their canoe and begin driving them through the mat, pushing until the points dig into the lake bed beneath. You can hear the dull squelch of mud yielding, the hiss of bubbles rising up around the wood. Each post stands upright, a small sentinel against the drift of waves. You might have expected them to tie things up neatly, maybe with rope or knots. Instead, they let the living willow do the work. Over time, it will sprout roots, grip the soil, and keep the garden firm. Historians still argue whether these first foundations were improvised or deliberately engineered from the very beginning. Was it trial and error, with a few floating rafts lost to the currents before someone thought to anchor them with willows? Or was it always intentional, passed down from earlier lake-dwelling cultures who already knew the lake's moods? For a mainstream fact, this technique dates back centuries before the Aztec Empire itself, possibly to the Teotihuacan era, meaning the Mexica people inherited and refined rather than invented it whole. What the Aztecs excelled at was scaling it up, multiplying chinampas across the lake, like a green quilt until the capital glowed with food security. As you watch the men press down the edges of the mat with muddy hands, you realize how simple yet ingenious it is. No cement mixers, no steel beams, just reeds, mud, and patience. If modern city planners were here, they'd probably demand an environmental impact statement, then secretly copy the design for their next eco-project. A quirky tidbit. Some legends claim that the first chinampa mats weren't meant to hold crops at all, but were floating platforms for ducks and other waterfowl. Fishermen supposedly noticed that wherever birds rested, droppings and feathers enriched the mat, making plants sprout. Imagine building a farm because your duck lounge chair accidentally turned into a garden. The farmers move with quiet confidence, their shoulders steady under the weight of willow poles. You can almost feel the suction in your own arms as they drive another stake into the soft lake bed. Each pole stands like punctuation, marking out the edges of this new plot. Over time, more mats will be layered in, mud shoveled on top, and eventually a rectangle of earth will appear, sturdy enough to hold maize, beans, squash, and maybe even you if you dared step on it. Your canoe bumps lightly against one of the willow stakes. The wood is rough under your hand, sap still sticky where the bark was stripped. You lean close and notice a small beetle crawling along the surface, unfazed by all this human ambition. It's as if the insects were early investors in the Chinampa project, already moving in to claim territory. You let yourself imagine the bigger picture, hundreds, even thousands of these islands stretching in neat lines across the lake, their edges trimmed with trees, their centers bursting with crops. The whole thing looks like a floating chessboard designed by someone who preferred farming to war, though the Aztecs, of course, liked a little of both. The farmers finish setting their stakes and climb into their canoe, poling away to fetch another load of reeds. The plot bobs slightly as waves pass, but it doesn't drift. The anchors are holding. You sit back, letting the scene drift into you instead of chasing after it. A heron lifts off nearby, wings whispering against the sky, and lands on one of the half-finished plots. Its long legs bend, its head dips, and in seconds it's plucked a fish out of the shallow water. You're reminded that the chinampas aren't just farms, they're ecosystems, blending human ambition with nature's own rhythms. The thought lingers, could this kind of farming solve modern food crises? Scholars debate it, pointing out that while the system was productive, it also relied heavily on the balance of a lake environment that no longer exists in the same way. Still, some experiments in Mexico City today suggest the method can work again if given the right space. You picture future city rooftops covered in reed mats and willow posts, urban gardeners poling around in inflatable canoes. Stranger things have happened. For now, you let the lake cradle you. The moon rises higher, silvering the water. The air smells of damp earth and willow bark. You hear a distant splash, perhaps a fish, perhaps a frog, perhaps just the lake reminding you it's alive beneath the surface. The unfinished chinampa waits quietly, already becoming more than it appears. From mats and mud, from patience and ingenuity, a floating world begins to take shape. And you drifting here are one of the few outsiders allowed to witness its first breath. The canoe eases along the canal until you spot a garden that looks more finished. This time you notice that the mat of reeds isn't visible anymore. Instead, the surface appears solid, a patch of dark soil laid out in crisp rectangular order. It looks just like a farmer's field in the countryside, except it's floating here, surrounded by rippling water. You lean closer, curious about how this transformation took place. The trick, you realize, is layering. First comes the base mat, weighed down by stakes. Then the farmers scoop mud from the lake bed, rich and black, and spread it evenly across the top. Each shovelful smells of silt and life, faintly fishy, faintly sweet. After mud, they add reeds, cut, dried, and piled in crisscross fashion. Almost like lasagna, except instead of ricotta cheese, you get decomposing vegetation. On top of that, another layer of mud, then more organic matter, then mud again. Like a patient baker frosting a cake, they build fertility one spread at a time. Here's your mainstream fact. This alternating system of mud and compost kept the chinampas astonishingly fertile. Rather than waiting for soil to regenerate, the Aztecs renewed it constantly, dredging fresh material from the lake. That mud was naturally replenished each year by erosion from surrounding hillsides, making the lake not just a water supply but a conveyor belt of nutrients. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some colonial records mention farmers tossing in the remains of old market food, fruit rinds, fish bones, chili stems to enrich their soil. Imagine recycling your dinner scraps by literally throwing them into your floating farm. The result was compost avant la lettre, long before suburban gardeners started bragging about their worm bins. Historians still argue whether this layering technique was standardized or improvised. Was there a strict recipe for chinampa construction, taught and passed down, or did each family experiment? Did some swear by 3 layers of reeds, while others insisted on 4? Maybe it was the ancient version of arguing about the right number of layers in lasagna. everyone's grandmother claiming their way was the only way. You run your fingers through the soil. It's damp but crumbly, clinging slightly before falling back in a soft patter. Small green shoots are pushing up here, barely the size of your fingernail but already sturdy. These are maize seedlings arranged in neat lines. In a few weeks they'll be taller than you, whispering in the breeze, a green army rustling on the water. To the side, a boy squats with a basket of seeds. He dips his fingers into the soil, pressing 1, 2, 3 beans into a mound beside the maize. Then he pats it down, smooths the surface, and moves on. You notice the Three Sisters system at work. Maize growing tall to support the beans, squash sprawling low to shade the soil. It's cooperative gardening at its finest, and you can almost hear the plants whispering to each other, like neighbors gossiping over a fence. The boy notices you watching and grins shyly. He points to a corner of the plot where chili plants grow, their leaves glistening. A small clay pot hangs nearby, half buried. He lifts the pot to show you it's full of water, a primitive irrigation trick to keep the roots moist. You nod appreciatively. Ancient hydrotech, simple and effective. As the sun rises higher, the soil glistens. You're struck by how lush everything feels compared to the world outside the lake, where hillsides are rocky and water scarce. Here it's like the earth is cheating, bending the rules of agriculture to squeeze more life out of the same space. You can understand why Spanish chroniclers describe the gardens as a paradise. The layering continues around you. Farmers with baskets of mud shuffle barefoot along the plots, scooping, spreading, patting it flat. The rhythm is hypnotic. Scoop, dump, spread, repeat. No one rushes. They know the lake provides endlessly, as long as they treat it with respect. A flock of ducks drifts into a nearby canal, quacking as they hunt for insects. One farmer shuffles over, scattering a bit of grain. The ducks dive, their tails sticking up comically. The farmer chuckles and tells you half seriously that ducks keep the soil happy. Maybe it's pest control, maybe it's fertilizer, or maybe it's just an excuse to keep ducks around. Because who wouldn't want ducks waddling through their floating farm? You tilt your head back. Willows stretch overhead, their roots dangling into the water, their branches trailing long shadows over the crops. These trees aren't just anchors. They also protect the soil from drying out. Here it's all one system, perfectly meshed. Mats, mud, reeds, crops, ducks, trees. Kind of gentle engineering that feels alive, not mechanical. You wonder if you could replicate this in your own backyard. Then you picture your landlord's face when you tell them you're flooding the patio to grow maize. Probably not worth it. The canoe rocks gently. You dip your hand in the canal water. It's cool, tinged with silt, and you feel tiny threads of algae slide past. Somewhere deep below, carp and axolotls wiggle through the mud. They've been living alongside these gardens for centuries, as much a part of the system as the maize above. You lean back, eyes half closed, letting the rhythm of scooping and layering soothe you. The chinampa beneath your gaze is no longer just a plot of soil. It's a quiet act of engineering genius, disguised as simplicity. The mist is thinning now, and pale streaks of dawn stretch across the lake. The air feels damp on your skin, cool but promising warmth as the sun climbs higher. You hear the dip of paddles, steady and quiet, as farmers guide their canoes through the narrow canals. One glides close by and beckons you aboard. You climb carefully, the canoe rocking under your weight, then settle onto the rough wooden bench. The farmer smiles, pushes away from the bank, and suddenly you're moving into the soft morning light. The world is just waking up. Frogs plop into the water. Dragonflies zip across the surface, their wings catching the first glints of gold. From far across the lake, you hear the muffled beat of a drum and maybe, just maybe, a flute's thin note winding into the morning. The farmer poles steadily, his movements unhurried, as though the day's labor is a gentle ritual rather than a race. Mainstream fact: Aztec farmers often set out before sunrise to tend their chinampas, using the cooler hours of the day for heavy tasks like hauling mud or planting maize. By mid-morning, the sun would be too fierce, the lake shimmering with heat, so early hours were precious. He gestures to a basket beside him. Inside are maize seedlings, their roots wrapped in damp fibers. You reach out and feel the tiny plants, delicate but strong, already smelling faintly of earth. The farmer chuckles, points at you, then at the seedlings, then at the rising sun, as if to say, "We all grow best when we start early." You glide past a chinampa where two men squat, pulling weeds from between maize rows. They move quickly, tossing the weeds into a basket that will later be composted back into the soil. A boy trails behind them with a small clay jug, sprinkling water at the base of the plants. The droplets glisten like jewels for a moment before vanishing into the soil. The canoe continues. You pass a woman kneeling on a reed mat at the edge of her plot, scattering amaranth seeds. She hums softly, a tune that ripples across the water almost as gently as the paddle. Her hair is bound with a strip of red cloth, and when she sees you watching, she grins and sprinkles a few seeds in your direction, as if blessing you with a harvest of your own. Quirky tidbit: some colonial observers noted that farmers sometimes planted maize at night by the light of torches, believing the darkness lent strength to the seeds. Imagine stumbling through the canals in the glow of firelight, carefully pressing kernels into damp soil, while frogs croaked encouragement from the shadows. The sun rises higher. Birds explode from the trees in a burst of noise, their wings scattering dew. The farmer poles the canoe gently around a bend, and suddenly the canal opens onto a wider expanse. Dozens of canoes drift here, each one carrying farmers, baskets of seedlings, or piles of fresh mud. The water reflects all of it: crops, trees, canoes, sky, until you can't tell where earth ends and heaven begins. Historians still argue whether this system of morning labor was rigidly organized by officials or more loosely guided by family tradition. Some sources describe a tightly controlled schedule, with overseers ensuring farmers rotated crops correctly. Others suggest it was more relaxed, left to household rhythms. Perhaps like most human habits, it was a little of both. Some days structured, some days improvised. The farmer beside you begins to hum as he poles, the tune low and rhythmic, matching the sound of wood against mud. You find yourself swaying with it, lulled by the cadence. He points toward the maize stalks, now shining bright green under the morning sun. And you feel the same thought he's humming: abundance, patience, balance. You pass another canoe, this one loaded with bright flowers: marigolds, dahlias, lilies. Their colors are almost shocking in the new light, a splash of red, yellow, orange, and white against the greens and browns of soil. The woman guiding that canoe nods at you, her arms steady as she pushes forward. Perhaps those flowers are destined for the temples, or maybe for the market, where they'll be sold alongside maize and beans. The farmer nudges you to look down. The water is clearer here, shallow enough that you see fish darting through reeds, one silvery flash, then another, and you realize that even the canals themselves are a kind of pantry, supplying protein to go with the maize and squash above. You tilt your head back, watching the sky brighten to pale blue. The chill of night is gone, replaced by a warmth that settles into your skin. A breeze stirs the maize stalks, and for a moment it feels like the entire lake exhales, as though relieved to have made it through another night. You close your eyes, listening. The rhythm of paddles, the hum of voices, the rustle of crops. And somewhere beyond, the muffled heartbeat of a city preparing to wake. Here in the canoe, you're part of it, just another passenger on a waterborne highway, carried along by the quiet science of farming that floats. Night doesn't fully vanish in this place. It lingers like a soft shawl draped over the shoulders of the lake. By the time the sun has cleared the horizon, shadows still cling under the willow trees and the water hums with life. You sit back in your canoe, eyes half closed, as the world around you begins its nighttime symphony, even though morning has officially arrived. It's as if the lake is stubborn, refusing to choose between day and night, letting you taste a little of both. The frogs are the loudest musicians. Their throats swell, and the sound ricochets across the canals in a chorus of croaks, each one distinct if you listen closely. Some are bass notes, low and resonant, while others are quick and chirpy like maracas in an orchestra. The insects follow, wings buzzing, legs scratching, 1,000 tiny violins scratching their restless song. Together it's not chaos, it's a patterned hum, the sound of life pulsing through water and soil. Mainstream fact, chinampa fields were not just farms, they were habitats. Amphibians, fish, insects, and birds all thrived in the canals. This biodiversity helped maintain balance, reducing pests and fertilizing crops naturally. The Aztecs didn't call it permaculture, but they practiced it daily. Your canoe bumps lightly against a willow trunk. The branches dangle low, trailing fingers across your shoulders. Overhead, a nightbird gives a sudden plaintive cry. You glance upward and see its silhouette vanish into the canopy. Then from far off comes the echo of a drum. Slow, heavy, 1, pause, 2, pause. Each beat carries across the water, mixing with frog song until it feels like the lake itself has a heartbeat. Quirky tidbit. Some sources claim Aztec priests believed the lake's nighttime chorus was a sign of the gods' approval. If frogs croaked loudly, if insects swarmed abundantly, the crops would flourish. In fact, one chronicler joked that if frogs ever went silent, the city would panic faster than if the markets ran out of chocolate. The farmer beside you doesn't seem fazed by the sounds. He adjusts his reed hat, leans back and lets the canoe drift. His eyes close, lips moving faintly as though he's whispering to the crops themselves. You realize this is part of the rhythm. Work by day, listen by night, and let the lake remind you that humans are only one small voice in a larger choir. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs consciously engineered this biodiversity or whether it simply evolved alongside their methods. Were they eco-geniuses who encouraged frogs, insects, and fish as part of the design, or were they just lucky to stumble upon a system that worked? Either way, the outcome is the same. Harmony. The symphony builds. You hear the slosh of a canoe turning in the distance, its prow cutting through moonlit ripples. Two men sing quietly as they pass, their voices weaving through the frogs and crickets. The tune isn't cheerful exactly, nor sad. It's steady, like rowing itself, meant to keep time, to remind the body of its rhythm. A breeze stirs, carrying the faint smell of roasting maize from the city's direction. For a moment, the earthy fragrance of chinampa soil blends with the smoky scent of kitchens. You imagine families sitting down to tamales while you drift here, serenaded by amphibians. A reminder that life's orchestra always includes a few clattering pots. The farmer nudges you and points. At the far end of the canal, you see ripples spreading. Then plop! A fish leaps clear of the water, flashing silver in torchlight before vanishing again. The frogs croak louder, as if applauding the performance. You chuckle quietly, realizing you've just witnessed the lake's equivalent of a standing ovation. Above, the stars are fading but not gone. A thin ribbon of clouds glows faintly pink. The sky is waking. But the earth insists on one more song before daylight fully claims it. You feel yourself swaying slightly with the canoe, lulled not by silence but by layers of sound. Somehow it's more restful than quiet. You rest your hand in the cool water, feeling the current tug softly at your fingers. Tiny bubbles rise, brushing your skin like the fizz of soda. Maybe it's fish stirring. Maybe it's the lake releasing its breath. Either way, it tickles. You pull your hand back with a grin, suddenly very aware that even the smallest sensations belong to this nightly concert. The farmer pushes the canoe toward a patch of reeds. He whispers something in Nahuatl, a word you don't understand but feel more than hear. It seems to mean, listen. So you do. And in that moment, with frogs roaring, insects trilling, drums echoing, and the water sighing beneath you, you realize this isn't background noise. It's the pulse of a world built not on machines or walls, but on mud, plants, and the music of living things. The sun is climbing higher now, turning the mist into ribbons of light, and you notice that the morning calm has shifted into something more purposeful. The canoes still glide silently, but there's a new rhythm to them, a subtle urgency. Today is not just any day. It's the day of a planting ritual, and the chinampas are about to host a ceremony as old as the city itself. Your farmer guide nods toward a group gathering on a broad rectangle of land. Families are assembling, men with baskets of seeds, women carrying clay bowls of water, children clutching garlands of marigolds. The air smells faintly of copal incense, drifting from a small brazier at the center. The smoke curls lazily upward, mingling with the cries of waterfowl and the rustle of maize stalks already standing tall on neighboring plots. Mainstream fact: the Aztecs practiced rituals for each agricultural stage: planting, growth, harvest, dedicated to gods such as Tlaloc, the rainbringer, and Xicomécotl, goddess of maize. These weren't just formalities. They reflected the belief that farming was a spiritual contract between humans and nature. A priest steps forward, painted in blue and white, carrying a bowl of maize kernels. He scatters a handful into the soil, then pours water gently after them. The gesture is symbolic, reminding everyone that seed and rain must work together. Children imitate him, their tiny fists tossing kernels into shallow furrows, laughing as birds swoop down to investigate. Quirky tidbit: some records mention that farmers whispered good dreams to their seeds as they pressed them into the soil, believing that maize grew straighter if it felt loved. If you've ever talked to your houseplants, congratulations. You and the Aztecs share the same gardening philosophy. The crowd hums softly, a chant that rises and falls like the motion of paddles. You find yourself swaying with it, lulled by its cadence. The priest raises his hand and everyone falls silent. He speaks words you don't understand, but the meaning is clear: gratitude. Gratitude to the soil, to the water, to the sun that will soon blaze overhead. You catch the faint glint of obsidian as he traces a symbol in the dirt, a reminder of the sharp edge between abundance and hunger. Historians still argue whether these rituals were strictly religious obligations or community traditions with practical benefits. Some scholars suggest they served as group therapy, strengthening social bonds and reminding farmers to cooperate. Others insist they were primarily devotional acts to appease the gods. Perhaps they were both, faith and practicality interwoven like reeds in a mat. The farmer beside you nudges your elbow and points to his basket. Inside are beans and squash seeds. He presses one into your palm, smiling as if to say, your turn. You lean over the edge of the chinampa, push the seed into the damp earth and pat it down. The soil is cool, yielding. You whisper something under your breath, not in Nahuatl, but in your own language. A promise that feels oddly sincere. A little girl watches you, She giggles, then plants her seed dramatically, clapping her hands as though she's already expecting pumpkins by dinner. Her grandmother ruffles her hair, amused. The cycle is alive here, generation to generation, each one folding into the next. As the ceremony continues, incense smoke thickens. The breeze carries it across the water, mixing with the scent of wet mud and maize pollen. Your eyes sting faintly, but the sensation is grounding. You feel in your bones that you're part of something older than memory. Suddenly, a flock of herons bursts upward, startled by the chant's crescendo. Their wings beat heavy against the air, shadows crossing the soil like fleeting blessings. Everyone pauses to watch, and even the priest smiles. Nature, it seems, has decided to participate. When the chanting subsides, baskets of food appear, tamales wrapped in leaves, tortillas fresh off flat griddles, bowls of chili sauce. Farmers sit on reed mats, children chasing each other along the canal banks, women passing clay cups of pulque. Planting, after all, is hungry work. You're offered a tortilla, warm and soft. The chili sauce burns your tongue, and you cough quietly to the amusement of the farmer's son beside you. He pats your back, proud that you survived the initiation. The ritual winds down. Seeds are in the ground, prayers have been spoken, stomachs are satisfied. The priest walks the edge of the chinampa, sprinkling water one last time. The sun is bright now, catching the ripples in the canal like broken glass. You lean back in the canoe, full and drowsy, lulled by the sounds of laughter, the rustle of maize, the slow settling of the lake. The ritual may be over, but the real ceremony, the daily act of living with the earth, has only just begun. The midday sun settles overhead, and the pace of life shifts again. You glide down a narrow canal, the canoe brushing against the reeds, and you notice something peculiar. Small rafts bobbing gently in the water, tethered to stakes or tucked against the edges of the chinampas. They are not toys, though they look fragile enough. They are floating gardens in miniature, experimental beds of herbs and flowers. You lean forward, curious, because these rafts seem like the ancestors of something much larger. Mainstream fact: chinampas were often called the floating gardens of the Aztecs, though they weren't actually drifting around the lake. They were anchored rectangles of soil and vegetation. But the idea of true floating plots, rafts made of reeds, soil, and plants, was an early technique, especially in regions where the lake bottom was too deep to build stable islands. One farmer demonstrates. He pulls a raft closer, its mat of woven reeds bound tightly together. On top, a layer of lake mud clings, dark and fertile. Small amaranth plants poke through, their leaves shimmering green against the water. He presses his hand into the soil, scoops up a clump, and offers it to you. The mud smells rich, almost sweet, like compost that has been brewing for centuries. Quirky tidbit: some chronicles suggest that children first tended these small floating rafts, both as practice and as a form of play. Imagine being a child in Tenochtitlan, drifting your personal garden toy down a canal, trying not to lose your pumpkin seedlings to a nosy duck. It's not much different from modern kids experimenting with bean sprouts in a classroom windowsill jar. The canoe drifts past another raft, this one bursting with marigolds, their orange petals blazing under the sun. The farmer explains that flowers were not only decorative, they were offerings, medicine, and, let's be honest, a way to make the neighbors jealous. You reach down and brush your fingers across the petals. They feel like soft paper, impossibly fragile yet thriving on nothing but water and muck. Historians still argue whether these floating rafts were primarily experimental, tertiaries, or whether they played a larger role in supplementing food supply. Some suggest they were prototypes, testing grounds for plant varieties before committing them to the bigger chinampas. Others think they were symbolic, miniature tributes to the gods of agriculture, proving that life could sprout even from the thinnest layer of soil. A canoe glides past, carrying a boy with a pole twice his height. Balanced in front of him is one of these reed rafts. He grins, wobbles dangerously, then steadies himself with surprising skill. He's ferrying his family's portable herb garden back home, probably to tuck it into the shade of their larger plot. You can't help but imagine what would happen if IKEA ever marketed a flat-pack floating garden. Somehow the Aztecs did it, centuries before modern. Hydroponics caught on. The farmer beside you chuckles at your fascination. He dips a small net into the canal, pulling up strands of algae. This slimy mess, he explains with gestures more than words, is smeared onto the reed mats as fertilizer. The algae act as glue, holding mud in place and slowly feeding nutrients into the roots. It's messy, but it works. You're starting to realize that nothing here is wasted. Every scrap of lake life is pressed into service, transformed into something edible or useful. Nearby, a woman in a canoe tends to another raft. She pinches leaves from a patch of epazote, a pungent herb often used in cooking. She tucks the sprigs into her basket, hums a tune and moves on. The raft rocks gently in her wake but doesn't tip. These little floating plots are sturdier than they appear, like rafts of stubborn hope refusing to sink. The sun glares hot, and you shield your eyes. The water reflects back 1,000 tiny sparks. For a moment, you feel like you're floating in a world made entirely of green and gold. The chinampas stretch around you, solid and lush, while the rafts drift at their edges, fragile experiments tethered against the current. You realize you're seeing both permanence and impermanence in the same glance. Fields built to last centuries, and rafts that might not survive a season. Children splash in the shallows, chasing minnows. One boy climbs onto a floating raft, stomps his feet proudly, and declares it his kingdom. His sister, unimpressed, tips the raft until he squeals and tumbles into the water. The adults laugh, unconcerned. After all, this is how the next generation learns balance, not just on the rafts, but in life itself. The canoe drifts onward. A heron lands gracefully on one of the rafts, standing like a solemn guardian among the herbs. The bird's weight causes the raft to dip, but it holds steady, bobbing gently. You think about the elegance of it all. Reeds, mud, plants, and even the birds working together in a rhythm that feels both fragile and eternal. You lean back against the canoe's edge, lulled by the rocking motion. The farmer adjusts the pole, guiding you toward the shadow of a tall maize field where the air is cooler. The sound of water slapping against reeds becomes hypnotic. It feels as if the rafts are not just floating on water, but floating you into a dream where gardens and canals and birds are all part of the same endless story. The sun has passed its peak now, and the shadows of tall maize stalks fall long across the water. You notice how the chinampas are arranged, row after row separated by narrow canals like green pages in a giant watery book. As you drift between them, the patterns become clearer, more deliberate than you first imagined. These are not random plots. They are carefully planned, engineered with a precision that could rival a modern city grid. Mainstream fact, chinampas were often constructed in rectangular parcels measuring about 30 by 2.5 meters, laid out in rows that maximized both sunlight and access to the canals. Wooden stakes marked boundaries, while willow trees planted at the corners rooted everything in place. Over time, these rows created an interlocking network of farmland and waterways that allowed efficient irrigation and transport. The farmer poles the canoe slowly, letting you take it in. From above, if you could float like one of those herons, you'd see neat rectangles stretching out like patchwork, their canals shimmering in the sun. Here on the water, though, you see the small details. Roots snaking through mud walls, clusters of reeds thickening the edges, ducks paddling lazily in the gaps. Quirky tidbit, some chinampas were rumored to have secret napping spots, little shaded corners hidden by willows, where farmers would drift off for a midday snooze. You suspect this isn't just rumor, because the farmer guiding you keeps giving wistful glances at a particularly shady tree. Farming may be sacred labor, but even the gods can't begrudge a nap. The canoe brushes against a wall of roots, and you run your fingers along the damp surface. It's firm, astonishingly so considering this is all built from mud and plant matter. The willow's roots lace through the structure like natural rebar, reinforcing the soil, holding the island together even during heavy rains. You realize that these chinampas are not static. They're alive, constantly renewing themselves, their strength coming from growth rather than stone. Historians still argue whether the arrangement of chinampas was primarily practical, meant for irrigation efficiency, or whether it carried symbolic weight, reflecting Aztec cosmology. Some researchers point out that the grid-like system resembled patterns used in religious art, as if farming itself was a sacred diagram of the universe. Perhaps the Aztecs didn't see a difference between designing a city and designing a field. Both were extensions of order imposed on chaos. The farmer pauses the canoe and gestures outward. Across the water, you see rows of chinampas disappearing into the haze. The symmetry is mesmerizing, but not perfect. Here and there, one plot juts out oddly, or a canal curves gently instead of running straight. These imperfections don't seem like mistakes. They feel intentional, as if the builders knew that nature resists absolute order and left wiggle room for the lake to breathe. A group of workers approaches from the opposite direction, their canoe piled high with reeds. They wave cheerfully, their paddles dripping arcs of sunlight. The farmer beside you calls something back, and they laugh in response. You realize that this watery grid isn't just for plants. It's for people, too. The canals are streets, the chinampas are neighborhoods, and the entire system hums with quiet, communal life. The breeze shifts, carrying the earthy scent of damp soil mixed with maize pollen. You close your eyes, and for a moment you imagine the view from centuries later, a Spanish observer seeing this same grid for the first time, trying to describe it to Europeans who could barely picture such a landscape. To them it must have seemed magical. A city floating on water, gardens anchored in the shallows of a shimmering lake. To you it feels oddly logical, as if this is how farming should always have been done. The farmer taps his pole against the canoe's edge, drawing your attention to a corner willow. Its roots have wrapped so tightly around the chinampa's side that they've created little caves where fish dart in and out. He explains, again with gestures, that these root hollows are perfect traps. Small fish gather here, and children scoop them up with woven baskets. Farming, fishing, and forestry all collapse into the same patch of land. Efficiency, you think, has never looked this graceful. You lean back, watching the play of light on the water. The canal reflects both sky and soil, heaven and earth, bound together by rows of mud and reeds. The chinampas aren't just practical. They're a philosophy written in plants instead of ink. Another canoe passes, carrying clay pots filled with young maize shoots. A boy balances carefully at the bow, steadying the pots while his father paddles. The sight makes you think of modern plant nurseries, only here the aisles are canals, and the shelves are bobbing canoes. As the light begins to soften, Shadows lengthening across the neat rectangles. You feel the calm weight of the system settle around you. Order and improvisation, grid and wiggle, permanence and change, all drifting together in this watery book of fields. The afternoon light leans golden now, and the air carries the mingled perfume of maize pollen, marigolds, and wood smoke from some distant hearth. Your canoe drifts past a cluster of chinampas, where the farmers are bent low, busy at their work. You hear the rhythmic scrape of a digging stick against earth, the splash of water as someone pulls up lake mud, and the chatter of neighbors calling back and forth across the narrow canals. Farming here isn't lonely work. It's a team sport, with everyone's livelihood tied to the steady rhythm of planting and harvesting. Mainstream fact, chinampas were incredibly productive, capable of yielding up to 7 harvests a year because of the nutrient-rich soil and constant water supply. Farmers grew staples like maize, beans, and squash, the famous 3 sisters of Mesoamerican agriculture, as well as chilies, amaranth, and herbs. The combination ensured not only full stomachs, but a balanced diet, something many other medieval societies could only dream of. The farmer in your canoe poles you gently to the side, so you can watch up close. A woman kneels at the edge of the chinampa, scooping thick mud into a basket. She carries it a few steps, dumps it onto the planting bed, then pats it flat with the grace of someone who's done this 1,000 times. Her hands are caked, her arms streaked, but her smile is easy as she greets another farmer across the water. Quirky tidbit: some chinampa farmers were known to sing to their crops, not just during rituals, but during everyday work. The songs were half lullabies, half pep talks, gentle reminders that maize should grow tall, beans should climb strong, and squash should spread wide. If you've ever tried to coax your Wi-Fi router into behaving, you know exactly the kind of half-serious pleading they were up to. A group of children plays nearby, but their game looks suspiciously like work. They're collecting weeds from the canal and tossing them into baskets. Every so often, they dump the weeds onto the chinampa soil, where it will rot into compost. You realize that these kids aren't being tricked. They're part of the system, learning by doing, playing their role in the cycle without fanfare. Historians still argue whether chinampa farming was primarily family-based, with each household tending its own plot, or whether larger community organizations managed them collectively. Some evidence suggests both. Individual families oversaw daily maintenance, but shared rituals, labor exchanges, and water management bound the community together. In either case, no one could really go it alone. The canals forced cooperation. You either got along with your neighbors, or your crops drowned. The farmer guiding you gestures to a row of maize, its stalks already taller than your shoulder. Between them, beans twist upward, their tendrils hugging the maize like old friends. At ground level, squash vines sprawl outward, shading the soil with their broad leaves. It's an elegant design. Maize provides the poles, beans fix nitrogen into the soil, and squash keeps weeds down. You lean closer, tracing the logic in the leaves, and wonder why more modern farms don't copy this green choreography. The breeze stirs the maize tassels, releasing pollen that drifts like golden dust. A boy runs by with a clay cup of water, splashing the base of young chili plants. He trips, laughs, and the woman nearby shouts something you're pretty sure translates to, "Careful, that's dinner." You grin because you know what a chili can do to your tongue. In another plot, herbs grow in neat clusters: epazote, sage, even tiny wild tomatoes. The air grows sharper here, each plant releasing its own distinct note into the olfactory symphony. You breathe it in, and for a moment you feel as though you're wandering through a fragrant apothecary floating on water. The sun shifts, glinting off the ripples, and you notice how the farmers move almost in harmony. One spreads mud, another plants seeds, another weeds by hand. The rhythm is quiet, steady, and hypnotic, like the turning of a wheel. Nothing about it looks rushed, yet everything gets done. A farmer across the canal raises a basket of amaranth leaves to show you. Their red-green hues shimmer in the sunlight, almost glowing. He tosses you one leaf and you chew it cautiously. The taste is sharp, grassy, with a hint of nut. He laughs at your expression, as though you've just been initiated into a private club. You lean back in the canoe, lulled by the combination of earthy smells, quiet laughter, and the steady scrape of tools in the soil. This is farming, yes, but it's also music, one you don't just hear but feel. The chinampas hum with a melody that has been playing for centuries, and you're only just learning to catch the tune. The light has taken on that late afternoon softness now, shadows long and edges blurred. As the canoe drifts, you find yourself watching the interplay not only of plants but of animals. For here in this liquid-stitched farmland, beasts and birds aren't intruders, they're colleagues. Mainstream fact, chinampas supported an ecosystem where farming and wildlife coexisted. Ducks, fish, frogs, and insects were abundant, and farmers took full advantage. Fish were caught with nets or baskets, ducks were herded into canals for easy capture, and frogs ended up in clay pots simmering with herbs. At the same time, these creatures provided natural pest control, eating insects and keeping the balance without chemical sprays. You hear a splash and turn to see a boy balancing on a wobbly reed raft, tossing crumbs to lure ducks closer. The birds paddle eagerly, quacking like gossiping old ladies. He waits until they're clustered tightly, then swoops his net with practiced ease. Two ducks flap indignantly inside, while the rest scatter with comic outrage. The boy beams, triumphant, his feet muddy but his technique flawless. Quirky tidbit. Some farmers tied little floating gourds around ducks' necks to prevent them from diving too deep. The birds could still swim and eat pests, but they couldn't escape into the depths. You can't decide if that was ingenious or just rude, though you admit the ducks waddling around with bobbing necklaces must have been a ridiculous sight. The canoe glides past the edge of a chinampa where frogs sit lined up on a log, as if waiting for a group portrait. They croak rhythmically, filling the air with a sound that blends with the rustle of maize. To the Aztecs, frogs weren't just food. They were also omens of rain. Their chorus was a weather forecast, a biological reminder that the rainy season was on its way. Historians still argue whether farmers deliberately designed the chinampas as ecosystems, or whether the thriving biodiversity was simply a fortunate byproduct. Some researchers suggest that the integration of fish, ducks, and crops was intentional, a kind of proto-aquaculture. Others think the farmers just adapted cleverly to whatever the lake provided. Either way, the result was a sustainable system. Modern agronomists still study with envy. You lean over the side of the canoe, peering into the water. Silver flashes dart beneath the surface, tiny fish quick and elusive. The farmer dips a woven basket, holding it still until the fish swim inside, then lifts it swiftly. A wriggling handful appears, shimmering in the sunlight. He grins, tips them back, and gestures toward you as if to say, "Easy dinner." Overhead, a heron circles before landing gracefully at the canal's edge. It strikes suddenly, pulling up a fish and swallows it in one gulp. The bird's yellow eyes glance at you briefly, as though daring you to compete. You chuckle softly, admitting defeat to the long-legged fisherman. The farmer points out dragonflies hovering over the water. Their wings glint like shards of stained glass, flitting endlessly between reeds. He explains that these insects are signs of healthy water, nature's quality control inspectors. Without them, pests would run wild. You sit back, appreciating that the smallest details, the flash of a dragonfly, the chorus of frogs, are part of the invisible scaffolding that holds the system steady. The smell of roasting maize drifts across the canal, reminding you that animals here aren't just helpers, they're meals. You pass a woman plucking feathers from a duck, her motions efficient and unhurried. The feathers drift like snow, catching in the reeds. A child gathers them up, probably to stuff a pillow or trade at market. Nothing, it seems, goes to waste. You can't help but marvel at the quiet elegance of it all. Ducks eat bugs. Bugs feed fish. Fish fertilize water. Farmers harvest both fish and maize, and then use duck feathers to pad their sleeping mats. Everything feeds into everything else, like the canals weaving through the chinampas. A splash startles you. One of the boy's captured ducks has wriggled free and dives into the water with a triumphant quack. The boy groans, farmers laugh, and you realize that even in this well-tuned ecosystem, chaos still has a sense of humor. You lean back, the canoe rocking gently beneath you, and let the sights and sounds wash over you. Frogs croak, ducks chatter, dragonflies buzz, and somewhere a dog barks on the distant shore. It's less like a farm and more like a symphony, every creature playing its part. Some in harmony, some in comic solo. And you? You're the guest in the audience, drifting slowly through this living, breathing orchestra. The sun dips lower, its light turning honey-colored across the canals, and your canoe slips into a quieter stretch. Here the water is darker, shaded by willows whose roots dangle like curtains into the canal. The air smells damp and sweet, carrying the earthy perfume of mud that has been stirred, sifted, and reshaped for generations. This is the secret heartbeat of the chinampa system, the constant rebuilding of soil. Mainstream fact: chinampa farmers regularly dredged mud from the lakebed and spread it over their plots. This practice, called China Middle Renewal, kept the soil fertile and replenished nutrients lost to continuous harvests. The technique allowed farmers to grow crops year-round without exhausting the land, a trick that modern agriculture, with its chemical fertilizers, still struggles to replicate sustainably. You watch as a man steps into the shallows with a long-handled scoop, a kind of flat-bottomed basket. He sinks it into the murk, lifts it carefully, and tips a dripping heap of black mud onto the chinampa's surface. The mud oozes like molten chocolate, rich and sticky. He spreads it evenly with the back of the scoop, smoothing it like frosting on a cake. The smell is strong but not unpleasant. It carries a sense of life, of things decomposed and reborn. Quirky tidbit: some farmers mixed shredded water lilies and even human hair into the mud layers. The lilies added moisture retention, while the hair, collected from haircuts in town, provided nitrogen. It makes you wonder whether the maize you're staring at grew up on a steady diet of yesterday's barbershop sweepings. Farming apparently has always had its odd secrets. The farmer guiding your canoe points to the freshly spread mud and explains, through gestures, that it's left to rest before planting. The resting period, though short, allows the soil to settle and release trapped gases. He pats the surface with his foot to show its firmness. You try the same, and your sandal sinks alarmingly deep. He laughs, helps you pull free, and you can't help but think the mud is alive, hungry for clumsy visitors. Historians still argue whether the dredging system was purely agricultural or also political. Some suggest that authorities organized communal dredging days, where families worked together under supervision, reinforcing social unity. Others believe it was left to individual households, a quiet, constant labor woven into daily routines. Either way, the outcome was the same: fertility that didn't fade, fields that outperformed European farms for centuries. The canoe drifts onward, and you notice subtle differences between chinampas. Some gleam with fresh mud, dark and glistening. Others show cracks where the soil is drying, waiting for renewal. A few are stacked with reeds cut into neat bundles, drying for future construction. Each plot seems to breathe at its own pace, inhaling mud and exhaling crops. A group of women on one chinampa kneels together, their skirts tucked high, hands busy mixing mud with cut reeds. They laugh as they work, their chatter floating across the water. One slaps a handful of mud onto her friend's arm, who retaliates in kind, and soon the work looks suspiciously like play. Children join in, smearing mud across their faces until they resemble little clay statues. The mothers shake their heads but smile. After all, if you're going to get dirty, you might as well embrace it. The farmer pulls you closer to show another technique. At the chinampa's edge, mud is pressed into blocks like bricks and stacked to reinforce the walls. Willow roots weave through them, binding everything tight. The blocks glisten, dark against the green reeds, and you realize this system isn't static. It's constantly patched, rebuilt, nudged back into shape. A chinampa is never finished. It's always becoming. You dip your hand into the canal, scoop up a little mud and let it ooze through your fingers. It's cool, smooth, and surprisingly fine. Not the sticky mess you expected. You think of modern potting soil, sold in neat plastic bags, and laugh quietly at the absurdity. Here the soil is free, endless, scooped up fresh each day from the living lake itself. A heron stalks nearby, stepping delicately across the chinampa's edge, stabbing its beak into the mud. It pulls up a wriggling worm and swallows it whole. The bird seems to wink at you as if to say, "Yes, even I know where the good stuff comes from." As twilight gathers, the air cools and the mud gives off steam in faint wisps. The sight is strangely comforting, like the earth itself is breathing out warmth as night approaches. The canoe rocks gently and you feel your eyelids grow heavy. You imagine yourself sinking slowly into that fertile mud, not in alarm but in a dream of being part of the cycle, broken down, reborn, growing again as maize or marigold. For the Aztecs, the mud wasn't just dirt. It was life itself, scooped from the lake, offered to the land, returned in harvest. And tonight, as the last rays of sun gild the rippling water, you understand why they treated it with quiet reverence. Evening settles over the chinampas, like a blanket of indigo silk. The air grows cooler, carrying with it the mingled smells of damp reeds, cooking fires from distant hearths, and a sweetness you can't quite place, maybe crushed flowers released by the cooling breeze. The water darkens into a mirror, rippling only when a fish breaks the surface or when the canoe's pole dips quietly below. This is the hour when the landscape changes mood, when work gives way to rituals of rest and preparation. Mainstream fact, the Aztecs observed seasonal cycles on the chinampas, adjusting planting schedules according to the 260-day ritual calendar, the Tonalpohualli, and the 365-day solar calendar, Xiupohualli. These two time systems interlocked like gears, guiding farmers not just in agriculture, but in festivals and offerings. To plant maize at the wrong time wasn't simply poor planning, it was seen as a breach of cosmic order. As the canoe glides, you see a group of farmers gathered near a small shrine at the edge of a chinampa. It's little more than a mound of stones with offerings scattered across it, flowers, clay figurines, and bowls filled with maize kernels. A flicker of torchlight illuminates painted faces. They bow their heads, murmuring words you can't decipher, but whose tone is unmistakably reverent. Quirky tidbit, offerings sometimes included tamales, which priests would feed to the earth. The idea was simple. If people ate tamales to stay strong, then surely the soil would appreciate the same courtesy. You picture a god of agriculture unwrapping a tamale with divine patience, and you can't help but smirk. Even in the most solemn rituals, there's a thread of homely practicality. The canoe pauses so you can watch. A priest sprinkles water over the soil while chanting. Another holds up a bundle of maize stalks tied with string, as though presenting them to the night sky. Children press marigold petals into the mud. It's not an elaborate ceremony, but its simplicity is powerful. Gratitude, recognition, the reminder that farming is a conversation, not a command. Historians still argue whether these nightly or seasonal rituals were organized by central authorities or left to local communities. Some claim that state officials used them as a way to maintain control, tying loyalty to the gods with loyalty to the empire. Others suggest they were deeply personal, family-led acts of devotion. Perhaps the truth, as with most things, lies somewhere in the shimmering water between. The priest's voice rises, and for a moment, even the frogs seem to hush. Then the chant ends and silence settles heavy, broken only by the soft rustle of reeds. One by one, people leave offerings: a woven mat, a clay cup of pulque, a necklace of dried beans. None of it looks extravagant, but you sense the weight of meaning each gift carries. The farmer guiding you gestures toward the shrine, as if inviting you to participate. He offers you a single maize kernel from his pouch. You roll it between your fingers, its smooth surface warm from his palm. Then, hesitating only a second, you place it at the shrine's base. The act feels small, almost silly, but also strangely grounding. You have added your voice, however clumsy, to a dialogue that's been going on for centuries. Nearby, a woman lights a torch, setting its reflection dancing across the canal. The light flickers against her face, turning her features into shifting shadows. She hums softly, maybe a lullaby for her children, maybe a hymn for the crops. Her song blends with the croak of frogs and the distant call of a night bird. The air grows cooler still. Farmers gather their tools, stacking baskets and paddles neatly, their motions unhurried. Children doze against their mothers' backs. Dogs bark faintly in the distance, guarding the edge of the settlement. The world is preparing to sleep, even as the crops continue their silent labor in the dark. A breeze carries the scent of incense toward you, its resinous sweetness curling into your lungs. You lean back against the canoe's edge, eyes heavy, ears filled with the quiet hum of life. The rituals may be ancient, but their rhythm feels familiar. Gratitude offering rest. It's not so different from how you might end your own day, whispering thanks for what went right, letting go of what didn't, and closing your eyes. Above you, the first stars appear, faint pinpricks in the fading sky. The shrine flickers with its small torch, a tiny echo of the heavens reflected in the canal's black mirror. And as your canoe drifts on, you realize that here on these chinampas, farming was never just about survival. It was about weaving human life into the fabric of time itself. The canoe drifts deeper into the night, and you notice the atmosphere shifting from solemn ritual to easy chatter. Farmers laugh softly, their voices carrying over the water like low bells. One older man squats at the prow of his canoe, whittling a pole while muttering to himself. His neighbor, paddling alongside, interrupts with a story. You lean in, eager for the gossip. Mainstream fact: Aztec farmers were deeply attuned to weather, often predicting rainfall through careful observation of natural signs. The croaking of frogs, the flight patterns of swallows, and even the thickness of morning fog were believed to forecast seasonal changes. This wasn't random superstition. It was centuries of empirical watching, folded into cultural lore. The storyteller grins, tapping his pole for emphasis. He insists that frogs aren't just noisy creatures, but singers of the future. According to him, when frogs grow restless and croak as though hosting a midnight concert, the rains are sure to arrive within days. The others chuckle, not because they doubt him, but because he delivers the line with theatrical exaggeration, puffing his cheeks and croaking in mock imitation. Quirky tidbit. One farmer swears that ants carry omens on their backs. He claims that if you see ants hauling food upward, toward higher ground, it's a warning that flooding is near. Another pipes up with an even stranger assertion. If a dog refuses its tamale, storms are brewing. You can't decide whether to laugh or take notes for your future weather app. The discussion rolls on like a current, blending humor and practicality. You picture modern meteorologists staring at satellite images, while here, in the soft dark of Tenochtitlan's chinampas, the signs come from frog songs and ant parades. Historians still argue whether these methods were mostly symbolic or whether they reflected genuinely accurate systems of local forecasting. Some suggest the Aztecs were proto-scientists, blending careful data collection with ritual language. Others believe much of it was folklore dressed up in authority. As the farmers swap predictions, you notice how their faces glow with torchlight. Their laughter is gentle, the kind that ripples rather than erupts. They tease one another about whose weather frog has been more accurate. One man insists his frog chorus predicted last year's floods perfectly. Another rolls his eyes and says his frogs must be tone deaf because his maize drowned despite their warnings. You realize this is more than idle chatter. It's the community weaving humor into the uncertainties of life. Nearby, a boy dips his hand into the canal, stirring tiny rings of silver. He points toward the reeds where frogs indeed sing in rhythmic unison. The sound is hypnotic, low, throaty, endless. You half expect the sky to open and release a curtain of rain right then, but the stars remain stubbornly clear. The boy looks smug anyway, as though nature just confirmed his family's forecast. A breeze sweeps across the water, cool and fragrant with the scent of wet mud. Somewhere in the distance, a jaguar calls faintly, its growl stretching like thunder. The farmers pause, eyes alert, then laugh again, saying even the jaguar must be predicting rain. You imagine what it would feel like to measure your future, not with charts or radar, but by listening to the forest's choir. The canoe shifts under you, rocking slightly, and you glance at your reflection. For a moment, the frog's chorus and the men's teasing blur together into a lullaby. You think about how uncertainty always creeps into farming, whether in the Valley of Mexico or in some suburban backyard garden. The need to explain, to prepare, to laugh in the face of not knowing. It's as human as it is Aztec. The conversation fades as the farmers grow quiet again. One of them yawns, setting off a chain reaction. Tools clink as they're laid down. Torches sputter, their smoke rising like faint columns in the night. The frogs continue, relentless, as if to remind everyone that predictions never sleep. And as the canoe drifts farther, you feel that lull settle into your bones. The strange, half-serious science of frog croaks and tamale-snubbing dogs may sound amusing, but it carried a rhythm of reassurance. People listened, laughed, and nodded, believing they weren't entirely at the mercy of the skies. In that belief, half joke, half faith, was comfort enough to close the day. The morning mist curls above the canals, and the air feels newly washed. The sun lifts slowly, casting golden fingers across the chinampas. You drift past fields where maize stands tall and proud, but today your eyes are drawn to something less familiar. Bright splashes of color ripple in the breeze, flowers, hundreds of them, their petals like tiny flags waving at the dawn. Mainstream fact, the Aztecs didn't rely solely on maize. Though maize, beans and squash formed the core of their agriculture, chinampas also produced an astonishing range of crops: flowers for offerings, herbs for medicine, and cacao beans prized not just as food but as currency. Entire areas of the chinampas were devoted to blossoms, carefully cultivated for rituals and trade. You watch a woman tending a row of marigolds, their golden heads glowing as if they've trapped sunlight overnight. She bends low, murmuring as she clips each bloom with practiced care. A little further along you spot rows of white lilies, fragrant and delicate, destined perhaps for temple offerings. You realize the chinampas weren't only about feeding bodies, they were about feeding spirits and senses, too. Quirky tidbit. One farmer tells you about a flower known as the chocolate daisy, said to release the aroma of cocoa at dawn. He claims priests once tucked them under pillows to inspire sweet dreams. You can't help but imagine a priest waking up with his face full of petals, dreaming of endless cups of hot chocolate. The canoe slides by a smaller bed where herbs grow in tidy bunches. Sage epazote, and a plant with feathery leaves whose scent stings your nose when you lean too close. These herbs weren't just flavor enhancers. They were medicine cabinets sprouting right from the mud. A mother gathers a bundle of herbs, pressing them to her chest before tucking them into a woven basket. Her child coughs softly, and you realize the herbs aren't for sale, but for healing at home. Historians still argue whether cacao beans were primarily grown on chinampas or imported from warmer southern regions. Some evidence suggests limited local cultivation, while others insist cacao was too delicate for the cooler valley climate. Either way, the sight of drying cacao beans on reed mats tells you the Aztecs valued it enough to make room for even the trickiest crops. You picture farmers whispering to their cacao plants, coaxing them to grow where nature resisted. Your guide points to another chinampa where brilliant red amaranth stands tall. Its grains shimmer faintly in the light, and you recall that amaranth was not just a staple food, but also mixed with honey and sometimes blood to form ritual figures eaten during ceremonies. You mutter to yourself that it's the ancient equivalent of edible action figures, deliciously unsettling. The air grows warmer as the day matures, and the scent of flowers thickens. Bees drift lazily from bloom to bloom, their low hum joining the music of distant drums. You realize that the chinampas weren't just farms, they were ecosystems, buzzing and alive with more than human labor. A group of children splash in the canal, holding up flowers like trophies. One boy crowns his sister with lilies, her hair dripping with water. Their laughter is sharp, bright, and momentary, but the flowers they hold carry centuries of meaning. A marigold will later mark a grave, guiding spirits back during festivals. A lily will be laid before a god's image. A cacao bean might jingle in a trader's pouch, as valuable as a coin. The canoe continues past beds of color until your senses blur. Reds, yellows, whites, purples, all swaying gently in the breeze. It feels almost theatrical, as though the farmers are stage designers, painting the chinampas not just with utility, but with beauty. You wonder how many visitors from abroad, Spaniards, traders, allies, arrived here and gasped at the sight, half convinced they had stumbled into a floating paradise. By the time you leave the flower fields, the morning has fully opened. The sun sits high, insects buzz with new energy, and the fragrance clings to your clothes. You breathe deeply, letting the sweetness calm you. These chinampas may be remembered for their maize, but it is their flowers and herbs that make the landscape sing, balancing the practical with the poetic. The air smells of fresh wood shavings, as you glide past a group of artisans at work. Their canoes are pulled up against the bank of a chinampa, and the steady rhythm of axes striking echoes across the water. You lean closer, fascinated by the transformation unfolding before your eyes, a raw tree trunk slowly becoming a sleek canoe. Mainstream fact: Aztec canoes, oracales, were typically hollowed out from single logs of ahuehuete, the Montezuma cypress. These trees, native to the Valley of Mexico, grew thick and sturdy along the lake shores, providing perfect raw material. Canoes varied in size, from small one-person vessels to long cargo boats capable of carrying several tons of produce. One craftsman squats beside the log, his arms rippling as he strikes it with a stone adze. Chips of fragrant wood fall into neat piles, while another man scrapes the interior smooth with a sharp obsidian blade. You notice how precise their movements are. There's no wasted motion, no clumsy swings. Every cut brings the canoe closer to the balance and grace it will need to glide silently across the canals. Quirky tidbit: you overhear a boy giggling as an elder explains that, in a pinch, people sometimes used large gourds as makeshift canoes. They weren't dignified, nor particularly stable, but they floated just enough to cross a narrow canal. You picture some poor farmer wobbling down the waterway in his giant vegetable boat, praying not to tip over and lose his tamales. The air fills with the scent of resin, earthy and sharp. A woman stirs a pot of sticky black pitch made from pine sap, heating it over a small fire. Once softened, the pitch will be smeared along the canoe's seams and bottom, sealing it against water. She works calmly, humming to herself while children chase each other with wood chips, pretending they're obsidian knives. Historians still argue whether Aztec canoes were sometimes fitted with woven reed extensions to widen their carrying capacity. Some suggest hybrid designs existed, combining the durability of wood with the buoyancy of reeds. Others claim this is a misinterpretation of Spanish accounts, which often confused reed rafts with true canoes. Either way, the ingenuity of the builders speaks for itself. You don't dominate a lake without mastering its vehicles. As the shaping continues, a young man climbs inside the hollowed trunk, testing it for balance. The log wobbles precariously, nearly tipping him into the mud, and everyone bursts out laughing. He grins sheepishly, muttering that he was only testing the waters. It's a moment of levity in the hard labor, proof that humor smooths even the roughest wood. You drift onward, following another canoe that's already finished. Its surface gleams in the sun, smooth as glass. The paddler dips his pole in rhythm, propelling the boat forward with effortless grace. The canoe glides like an extension of the water itself, silent, steady, indispensable. Along the canals, traffic picks up. One canoe piled high with squash glides past, its weight making it ride low in the water. Another is filled with flowers, a floating bouquet bound for the market. You see a narrow canoe carrying 3 fishermen, their nets spread like wings above the water. Everywhere you look, canoes stitch the chinampas together like moving threads in a watery tapestry. A breeze rustles through the cypress trees, their shadows stretching long across the canal. You realize that without these trees, without the hands that shape them, Tenochtitlan would feel broken, its arteries clogged. Canoes were not just tools. They were the lifeblood of the city, and as you lean back against the canoe carrying you now, you feel grateful for the quiet genius of those who could turn a log into a vessel of dreams. The sun lingers high now, glinting off the water like shards of polished obsidian. You drift toward a chinampa where daily routines unfold, and your attention shifts from crops and canoes to the people themselves. The rhythm of labor here isn't random. It's choreographed by custom, obligation and unspoken agreements about who does what, and when mainstream fact. In Aztec society, gender roles were distinct yet complementary. Men were expected to perform tasks requiring physical strength, digging mud, hauling baskets of sediment, or poling heavy canoes. Women, meanwhile, managed domestic tasks like grinding maize into dough, weaving textiles, preparing meals, and even handling much of the small-scale trade. Both roles were considered essential to sustaining chinampa life. You watch a man, muscles straining, lift a dripping basket of mud from the canal and spread it across the soil. His back glistens under the sun, and the sweat trickles down his spine. Just a few steps away, his wife kneels before a grinding stone, rhythmically turning maize kernels into fine mesa. The steady scrape of stone on stone is almost hypnotic, as though the earth itself were purring in approval. Quirky tidbit. One grandmother chuckles as she explains that if a woman dropped a tortilla into the fire too often, it was taken as a sign that she might be careless as a wife. You glance at the sizzling griddle and picture some poor young bride nervously flipping her tortillas while her in-laws silently judged her worthiness, one scorched flatbread at a time. Nearby children scamper across the chinampa, tugging at weeds and splashing each other when their parents aren't looking. A teenage boy wields a paddle, ferrying his younger siblings across a narrow canal, while his sister carries a basket of herbs balanced gracefully on her head. Even the smallest members of the family contribute in their own ways, though their contributions are often laced with play. Historians still argue whether these roles were rigidly enforced or more fluid in practice. Some accounts suggest that women occasionally worked in the fields and men helped with grinding maize during festivals or shortages. Others insist the divide was stricter, reinforced by education and ceremony from childhood. You can imagine both being true. Culture is rarely a perfect blueprint, more often a watercolor with blurred edges. Your canoe drifts past a home where smoke curls lazily from a hearth. Inside, a woman stirs a bubbling pot while her daughter shapes tortillas, their hands moving with quiet efficiency. Across the canal, a man sharpens his digging stick, pausing occasionally to stretch his shoulders. The harmony is striking. This isn't a competition of tasks. It's a duet, each voice necessary for the song to be complete. You catch the scent of chili mingling with the air. A woman sprinkles red powder into the pot, the steam making your eyes prickle from afar. She laughs softly, wiping her brow with her sleeve, then scolds her son for stealing a roasted pepper before it's ready. His yelp of protest draws more laughter than sympathy. As the afternoon unfolds, the hum of labor takes on a sleepy cadence. You sense that here work isn't merely survival, it's a rhythm that structures the day, a rhythm that binds families together. Tasks repeat endlessly, like the cycle of seasons. Yet within them there's space for conversation, teasing, and even pride. The canoe rocks gently beneath you, its shadow floating alongside. You realize that without these carefully balanced roles, the chinampas would falter. Mud would go unhauled, maize would go unground, children would go untended, and meals would never reach the table. The strength of this floating world lies not only in its engineering, but in the people who sustain it, each doing their part, each trusting the other to do theirs. And as the sun dips a little lower, the scrape of the grinding stone and the splash of the mud basket begin to sound less like work and more like a lullaby. Steady, timeless, unshakable. By the time afternoon shadows stretch across the chinampas, you've already seen the devotion of farmers, the careful rituals of families, and the playfulness of children. But every society, no matter how organized, has ways of nudging people back into line when they drift off course. The Aztecs, it turns out, had their own peculiar sense of justice, equal parts practical, embarrassing, and occasionally hilarious. Mainstream fact: Aztec punishments often emphasized public shame rather than severe violence, especially for minor infractions. Laziness, gossip, or breaking small community rules could earn someone penalties that were designed to sting the ego far more than the body. Harder crimes, of course, had harsher consequences, but day-to-day discipline leaned toward correction, not cruelty. You overhear a group of farmers swapping stories about such punishments as they patch up a chinampa wall. One laughs as he recalls a young man who skipped his canal cleaning duty. Instead of being fined or beaten, he was forced to sing an apology in the town square, loudly and with improvised verses. The song went on so long that children began chiming in, turning his shame into a community chorus. You can't help picturing the poor man blushing beet red while an entire market clapped to his accidental debut concert. Quirky tidbit: one elder insists he once saw a lazy farmer tied briefly to a log and left floating down the canal until he promised to work harder. The image makes you laugh. Less horrific punishment and more awkward river taxi of shame. The farmer was retrieved after a short drift, wet but wiser, and reportedly more diligent ever since. Historians still argue whether these punishments were formalized laws or more like local customs enforced by community leaders. Spanish chroniclers sometimes exaggerated them for drama, while archaeological evidence remains slim. What is clear, though, is that public embarrassment carried real weight in a world where reputation meant survival. You glide past a group of boys who mimic this tradition in play. One pretends to be the lazy farmer, while the others march him to a reed mat and demand he sing. His improvised tune, mostly nonsense syllables, sends them all tumbling into the grass with laughter. Even in mockery, you sense how cultural norms ripple forward, teaching lessons through games. As you watch, you think about how modern punishments, detentions, traffic fines, awkward HR meetings aren't really so different. The point isn't always pain. It's about making sure people remember. And embarrassment, whether in a chinampa village or a modern office, lingers far longer than a bruise. The sun lowers further, casting warm stripes across the water. Somewhere nearby, a farmer clears his throat, as though preparing to sing. The others snicker knowingly, though this time it's just for fun. You imagine the tune drifting across the lake, half apology, half lullaby, a reminder that even mistakes can be woven back into the rhythm of life. And as the canoe rocks gently beneath you, you feel a smile creep across your face. It seems that in the Aztec world, discipline wasn't just about correction. It was about laughter, humility, and bringing people back into harmony. The light softens into amber, and the canals shimmer like liquid bronze. You've seen the chinampas rise from mud and reeds, watched canoes carved from tree trunks, even chuckled at punishments involving reluctant singers. But there's a quiet puzzle that lingers under all of it, like the lake's own secret. Were these floating gardens truly floating, or were they fixed islands cleverly disguised? Mainstream fact: most descriptions of chinampas explain them as artificial fields built in shallow lake beds by layering reeds, mud, and compost. Over time, willow trees planted at the corners anchored the structure. The result was a semi-permanent plot that could last for centuries, not just a drifting raft. Yet Spanish accounts often exaggerated, calling them floating gardens, as if they were giant lily pads gliding across the water. As your canoe slides forward, you imagine stepping onto one of these chinampas. The ground feels springy beneath your feet. Not quite solid like stone, but firm enough to support houses, trees, and whole families. Farmers stomp the earth to compact it, reinforcing the edges with woven reed fences. It's less raft and more living architecture. Quirky tidbit: one chronicler claimed he once saw a chinampa drift loose during a storm and bump against another, like two houseboats colliding. Whether true or just a tale, you picture farmers waking to find their neighbor's hut awkwardly parked in their maize field, shouting across the canal, "Mind moving your garden back to your side?" Historians still argue whether the word floating was a poetic flourish by early Spanish writers, or whether small, truly mobile chinampas also existed alongside the fixed ones. Some scholars insist that mobile gardens were used for seedlings, floated to sunnier spots before replanting. Others believe the image of drifting fields is simply too romantic to let go, a metaphor that clings tighter than fact. The debate isn't just academic. It shapes how we imagine this watery world. A city built on steady artificial islands feels ingenious, but one surrounded by roaming, floating fields feels almost mythical, like something out of a dream. Perhaps that's why the legend persists. We want these gardens to float because the image soothes us, blurring the line between engineering and magic. As you drift, you glance down. The water is shallow, its bottom visible in patches where reeds break the surface. You imagine farmers kneeling in canoes, scooping up black sediment to smear across the chinampa's top. With each layer, the floating illusion grows stronger. From a distance, the fields appear to float effortlessly, but up close they reveal their tethered roots, their careful anchoring. The canoe passes under the arching limbs of a willow. Its roots dip directly into the water, binding soil to lake. You trail your hand along the trunk, rough and cool, and realize that the tree is both farmer and architect here, digging, stabilizing, holding everything together. The air grows still, heavy with the scent of damp earth. Farmers argue softly on the bank about the right word to describe their world. Is it an island? A raft? A garden? A miracle? You realize the truth may be all of these at once. The sun dips lower, the light paling into pink. The debate, like the chinampas themselves, doesn't end. It stretches into twilight, unresolved yet strangely soothing. Floating or fixed, these gardens endure, anchored in both mud and memory. And as your canoe glides silently onward, you realize that sometimes the mystery itself is part of the comfort, a puzzle left deliberately unsolved so that the imagination can keep drifting. Twilight gathers as if someone has drawn a sheer curtain across the lake. The chinampas, once sharp and green in the daylight, blur into dark silhouettes. You notice patches where the canals are clogged, choked by weeds and silt. The water here moves sluggishly, reluctant as if tired of centuries of carrying canoes. It is in this quiet, almost mournful hour that the story begins to bend toward decline. Mainstream fact: after the arrival of the Spanish in the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan's chinampa system began to suffer. Military conquest, disease, forced labor, and the redirection of water for colonial projects all eroded the intricate balance that had sustained the gardens. Canals were filled to make streets. Some fields dried out, others drowned in floods when dikes fell into disrepair. As your canoe glides through one such half-forgotten canal, you spot a collapsed chinampa edge, reeds falling in messy tangles. It looks like the skeleton of something once alive, still faintly beautiful in its ruin. A farmer stoops nearby, poking the soil with his stick, sighing as though hoping it might remember its old strength. Quirky tidbit: there are stories of Spaniards initially trying to farm chinampas, but giving up quickly. Used to dry land plowing, they found the constant mud hauling and water management baffling. One friar even complained that the field seemed to swallow his boots. You grin at the image of a dignified priest stuck ankle-deep, flapping his arms while farmers looked on, unimpressed. Historians still argue whether the chinampas declined mainly because of deliberate colonial neglect, or simply because the city expanded too rapidly. Some point to Spanish records that describe vast stretches abandoned within decades. Others argue that indigenous farmers adapted, keeping many plots alive well into the 18th century, though on a smaller scale. The truth, perhaps, is less tidy, a slow fading rather than a sudden end. You lean back, letting the canoe drift. The air smells faintly sour, stagnant, lacking the vibrant sweetness of flower fields. The frogs still sing, but their chorus feels thinner, as though the choir has lost some of its members. Above, the stars prick through, indifferent to the fate of gardens below. A group of children paddle past in a shallow canoe, their laughter high and bright, cutting through the gloom. They carry no baskets, no tools, only curiosity. You wonder if they even realize the waterway they play on was once the artery of a vast empire, carrying maize and marigolds to markets that fed hundreds of thousands. Their joy feels like a small rebellion against decline, proof that memory can survive in laughter. The canoe you ride rocks gently, its poles scraping the canal bottom. You think about how fragile brilliance can be, how a system praised as one of the most productive on Earth could within a generation falter. And yet, even in decay, it whispers its legacy. Innovation, adaptation, resilience. The night deepens, and the outline of the city beyond the canals flickers with torchlight. Some chinampas persist, glowing faintly as if defying the darkness. Others crumble quietly back into the lake. You drift between them, caught between past glory and slow surrender, feeling the melancholy weight of a paradise slipping into memory. The lake greets you with morning mist, soft and silver, as if the water itself exhales one long sigh. You paddle slowly, almost lazily, along a canal that feels familiar but subtly altered. Instead of the tightly packed maze of chinampas from centuries ago, you find open stretches of water, punctuated by clusters of surviving fields. The past still lingers here, but it shares the stage with a gentler modern rhythm. Mainstream fact. Today, the remnants of chinampa culture are most visible in Xochimilco, a southern borough of Mexico City. Here, farmers still cultivate vegetables and flowers on plots that echo the Aztec design. Though modern pressures, urban sprawl, pollution, water diversion have reshaped the system, fragments of the old engineering remain in active use. Tourists come in gondola-like boats called trajineras, painted in bright colors, often bearing names like Lupita or Juanita. You drift past one such boat now, its sides decorated with swirls of pink and yellow. On board, a family sings softly, the guitar plucking a tune that seems to bounce across the water. Someone claps out of rhythm, but no one cares. The canal carries their joy the same way it once carried baskets of maize. Quirky tidbit. The gondolas have become famous for their floating mariachi bands. Imagine you're lying back, eyes closed, drifting towards sleep when suddenly, trumpets. It's perhaps the least boring thing Xochimilco offers. But the sight of musicians balancing in a rocking boat while belting out rancheras is undeniably soothing in its absurdity. You chuckle to yourself, half expecting a frog to join in on backup vocals. Historians still argue whether today's Xochimilco chinampas should be considered authentic continuations or merely cultural echoes. Some argue they preserve invaluable knowledge of sustainable farming, while others suggest they function more as heritage tourism than agriculture. The debate drifts like the boats themselves, never fully moored. As your canoe glides further, you notice that despite the crowds, pockets of stillness survive. A heron stalks quietly along a reedy edge. Farmers lean over plots of lettuce and spinach, pulling weeds with the same patience their ancestors used for maize. You smell damp earth, freshly turned. A dog barks on a distant islet, its voice thin but determined. You remember the croaking frogs predicting rain, the layered mud and reeds, the grandparents telling stories in the shade. Those images flicker like shadows across the water. Though time has reshaped this place, the essence endures. People coaxing abundance from unlikely soil. Water carrying both sustenance and memory. The gondolas fade into the distance and the canal grows quieter. You trail your fingers through the water, cool and smooth, thinking of how many generations have done the same. The floating gardens may not be as vast or grand as they once were, but they whisper on, teaching anyone willing to listen that ingenuity and patience can transform even a lake into a city of food and flowers. The air warms as the sun rises, scattering the mist. You breathe in deeply and slowly, carrying with you not only the story of chinampas, but also the feeling of their persistence, fragile yet unbroken, fading yet unforgettable. And so you lean back in your drifting boat, letting the ripples lull you as the centuries blend. You have walked, paddled, and floated through the rise, the brilliance, the humor, the decline, and the survival of these gardens. Their quiet science, their absurd quirks, and their enduring presence leave you with one truth. Even when worlds shift, some roots cling stubbornly, offering shade, food, and memory. Now the story begins to soften, like the water's surface smoothing after a ripple. The canal is almost still now, reflecting the sky in long, unbroken lines. Your canoe drifts without effort, the pole resting at your side, the water carrying you gently forward. The voices and colors fade away until all that remains is the hush of water against wood and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. You feel your body ease, shoulders slackening, breath falling into a slower rhythm. The gardens you've explored slip into memory, their edges blurred like reeds in twilight. You let them fade. Mud and willows, maize and marigolds, frogs and laughter, becoming a quiet collage in the background of your mind. The night air cools. The stars shimmer faintly, patient and steady, as though they have been waiting the entire time for you to notice their calm. The boat rocks once, then steadies, and you allow yourself to sink into its rhythm. Every sound grows softer now. Even the croak of the frog seems hushed, respectful of your rest. The air carries only the faintest scent of earth and water, a reminder that you are safe, floating, carried without effort. And as the story closes, there is no urgency, no ending marked by sharpness, only the comfort of knowing the gardens continue somewhere in some form. Their persistence is yours to borrow tonight, steady, gentle, unhurried. So breathe deeply, let the last traces of sound dissolve, and allow yourself to drift into sleep as the water carries you onward, calm and unbroken.